Hi, today I'm going to talk about escapism, the desire to be or to live somewhere or some way other than where you live at the moment or where you are at the moment. This comes out of the book that I published earlier this year called Late Escapism and Contemporary Neoliberalism: Work, Alienation, and Utopia. And that book is an attempt to define a field of studies that I'm loosely calling escapism studies. As such, it approaches escapism from many different angles. It begins, first of all, by describing what we might want to escape from. In other words, how is society organized in a way that makes escapism necessary? And it looks at some of the inequalities, social dislocations that exist, and the addictive responses to those dislocations. It looks at the political responses to escapism, both left and right. It looks at work, the activity of labor that most people have to engage in order to make society function, and why that might be a source of escapism. And then it looks at the expressions of this desire for escapism through art, music, and literature before finally deciding if it's possible to have a political response to escapism. All of these, I think, are incredibly interesting and productive avenues for research and theorization, but I want to focus on what I consider to be a key premise without which a theory of escapism falls apart, which is that escapism requires a subject, an identifiable subject with thoughts, feelings, and desires. So, although this book draws upon structuralism, let's say an older structuralist tradition, it is definitely not against a theory of the subject or not against a conceptualization of the subject. Put simply, to have escapism, you need people who want to escape, which means you need people. And for that, it is a form of humanism. It requires a form of humanism, what I'm calling concrete humanism. If we're going to identify this subject, we need to look at people, real people, and how they live their lives, and in the materialist tradition of philosophy, how they reproduce and produce themselves, each other, and society as a whole. This form of materialism has a history. So when we look at history, we are examining how people live. What are the conditions at which they create and which they are created or constituted by? We're not talking about a vision of spirit or ideas through history. We are talking about the actual relations in which people live. Now, these relations are obviously conflicted, contradictory, and even involve some oppression. So if we're defining a subject, we are defining a subject within particular conditions. And I'm saying here, the book tries to say that these conditions are not conducive to the expression of the personality. So with a subject, we talk about what they might want, but we also have to talk about how what they want gets suppressed or sublimated. Now, because we're talking about real people, we are we are pushing aside certain ahistorical ideas of how people live or how people are. I think most popularly, this is considered to be human nature. Humans are the way they are because humans are naturally greedy or selfish or noble. Both of these, this model rejects. The premise for understanding escapism is to understand how people think and act. And to do that, we have to not look at what they say about themselves or what they wish they were, but how they actually live socially and how they produce and reproduce themselves. This is a model with a long history. It traditionally involves studying social relations, how people relate to one another in a particular mode of production, Interestingly, it also involves how that mode of production impinges upon people's personal psychology. How do people act and think in a society governed by social relations, particular social relations of production, which for shorthand I'm calling work, work within the market, and work within the market for labor power? There are, I think, two opposing theories which this model also opposes when we talk about work and existence in a social relations of production, which, for want of a better word, we're going to be calling capitalist. There is the ideology of the free actor who makes choices on the market to maximize rather their utility. Uh, we know this from neoclassical economics. This also is a foundation for behavioral economics, which might want to study why the actor is not behaving rationally. So the rational individual actor maximizing their uses in the marketplace, that's the baseline. And if something deviates from that baseline, we need an explanation. This study, and I'm going to refer to it again as concrete humanism, study of real, actual people in their actual lives of production, reproduction. It's not necessarily about the individual decisions as an additive model, but rather it's the social context of those decisions. And that means that it avoids both this idea of this supreme rational bourgeois individual, but also the opposite, which is the individual with no willpower, utility, perception of their own. What's popularly called, possibly called, both are correct, being brainwashed. So this brainwashing model is common on both left and right, and its central premise is that, in contrast to being rational, people are 100% irrational. They can't see through their exploitation or their irrationality. They eagerly adopt it, or they're just too distracted to care. And this is the famous premise of They Live, John Carpenter's movie from, I believe, 1988, which, if you haven't seen yet, I highly recommend checking out. You are fully suffused by ideology. You put on the sunglasses and you see through this. In contrast, there is a concrete humanism that says people are neither free nor brainwashed. In this system, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's alienated, people retain their subjectivity and even their creativity in a system that doesn't encourage either of those things. The reason it doesn't encourage subjectivity or creativity is because a large part of our social and self-definition is spent defining ourselves through work, and that work itself is forced. In other words, we are forced to sell our labor power in the market and receive a wage. This is very different from activity that expresses a creative capacity. Sometimes the two link or overlap. Sometimes one can sell oneself for labor or doing labor, let's say, that allows the expression of a creative capacity, but not very often. I'm defining this as a loss of control, a substantive and very, very foundational loss of control as soon as one enters into the labor market, and one must enter into the labor market. From this, everything else flows. The basic act of work itself is forced. The makers are separated from what's made and over decisions about what is made, but there is a loss of control, which appears also in those who aren't allowed to work, those who are working unpaid, those who are enslaved. As well, at a deeper level of abstraction, there are the regular economic and ecological crises of capitalism that land unevenly across different spaces, also across different identities and the people who inhabit those spaces, which, as we all know, are raced, gendered, nationalized, et cetera, et cetera. But what this means in terms of loss of control, or traditionally called alienation, is that it's not just at the workplace, which is sometimes I'm skirting around the issue of labor alienation, but sometimes this is the stereotypical view of alienation, which we were just talking about work and workers. We're talking about the big men in the overalls, the theory of 20th century industrial organization. We are talking much broader than that, in fact. Alienation, once you look, is everywhere. Hence, the title of the book is not work. The title of the book is escapism. This process of selling yourself or selling oneself begins long before one actually has to enter into the system of selling oneself. We are all interpolated into the system of labor as is currently organized. We are produced by subjects by the system that alienates us. And this is the premise that I wish to suggest is a good way to understand escapism. We enter into society as real individuals, concrete, with real histories and real creativity and real desires, but we have to survive by hiding those desires because we have to sell our time and adapt ourselves to the modalities of the workplace. These desires and creativity are still there. They are hidden. The system is normalized. Everybody does it. A fair day's work for a fair day's wages is still, after 150 years, is still the guiding principle of work. And we consider ourselves lucky. And in a very real sense, we are lucky if we get a fair day's work for a fair day's labor because that gives us a chance to survive. So this disjuncture between the creative self and the presentation of the self for work, which is engaging in an alienated activity, where is the space to express this disjuncture? Where does it come from? Where does the forced lack of self-knowledge, which is necessary many times to survive for decades as a worker, when that system is naturalized, where does that space appear? Where do we go to access that alienated creative subjectivity? I'm going to suggest we go towards escapism. That escapism in this case expresses something real. And I want to, in doing so, avoid the rational actor argument that I referred to earlier. I am saying that people are rational, that there is something deeply rational about about escapism, but escapism looks irrational. Escapism appears as shirking, as sabotage, as absenteeism, as daydreaming, all these activities that are not rational from a market perspective, because if you engage in those activities, you might lose your job, the firm will suffer. All these activities are against the maximization of utility, but the maximization of utility is not the metric that applies here. In fact, the most rational, consciously, openly expressed rational thing to do is to avoid work altogether. And if that wasn't true, escapism wouldn't exist. So many people wouldn't spend so much time dreaming of being elsewhere or doing other things. Most people cannot stop work. Most people cannot avoid work altogether. This is a fact of life in our system. And once again, we are not talking about work as activity. We are not talking about work as the sole focus concentrating on something that genuinely piques your interest. We are talking about work as a forced sale of labor. Given that most people engage in this activity, the counter argument appears at first stronger, that we are brainwashed, because it appears irrational. Why, according to this premise, if work is a forced choice, why do people go to work and then just dream about doing something else? Why do people participate in an alienated society that regularly throws up crises of the economy, crises of the environment? It doesn't make any sense. Therefore, they are either brainwashed consumer slaves. We're very familiar with this model. They're ignorant. People don't realize how bad the system is. People don't realize how easy it is to be free. They must be woken up, usually by a privileged minority. The people who claim the brainwashing model are never the brainwashed themselves. They have seen the light. What I want to suggest here is that what appears irrational from both sides, both perspectives, which is the appearance of apathy and fatalism. And this looks different depending where you go, depending who you speak to. Sometimes it's just an inability to engage with the bigger world. Sometimes it's just a focus on survival day to day, and then you get home, you binge watch your series. This is not an irrational activity. This is a protective activity. So the role of the worker, the person who goes to work every day or looks for a job every day, maybe they haven't sold their labor power, haven't sold their time. Maybe they work for free at home, outside the home. Maybe they are involved in unpaid domestic labor like childcare. Their role is to survive. Desire, the libidinal drives that push desire, which the book also gets into, but which I won't talk about today. These have to be suppressed and denied. And in fact, they have to be channeled into productive activity, productive alienated activity. Escapism is the reappearance of that subject, the creative alienated subject along safe avenues such as fantasy, dreaming of better worlds without actually going there, whether those worlds exist in reality or not. Escapism is two-sided. It's a safety valve, but it's also a sign that subjectivity itself hasn't been erased. So I'm calling escapism a form of mediation between the individual self and an alienated society. And that way, I actually think escapism is positive. It's not negative, although in itself it can take negative forms, but the appearance of escapism points to an alienated reality which we have to try to escape from because it separates us, because it denies our fundamental capacities to be creative. We are not non-sentient robots. And this is precisely why humanism, the theory of the alienated, concrete individual, has to be negative because it recognizes the conditions that have to be negated for creativity to flourish. And this is why escapism matters, as a sign that there are real, concrete individuals making up the real concrete world. Each of us has the potential for creativity. Many of us have that potential denied. I'm going to throw a slide up on the screen. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to either visit my website and you can send me a form through the website, or you can simply email me. I have review copies available as PDFs. Also, feel free to ask your library if they have the book. I encourage all sorts of engagement with this topic. I look forward to hearing more responses and hope we can spark a conversation about this. Thank you.